Hi everyone, I'm Heather Bingham. I'm a Senior Programme Officer at the UN Environment Programme World Conservation Monitoring Centre, also known as UNEP WCMC, where we manage the Protected Planet Initiative. This initiative houses the World Database on Protected Areas, or WDPA, which many of you will have heard of. And since 2019, it also houses the World Database on Other Effective Area-Based Conservation Measures, or WD-OECM. I'm going to talk about the process for recording data on privately protected areas in the WDPA, which is covered in Chapter 7 of IUCN's Guidelines on Privately Protected Areas. And I'm also going to talk about how this relates to the process of recording data on OECMs. But first, I'm going to focus on protected areas and on the World Database on Protected Areas. And I'll start by providing a bit of background. So the WDPA is a joint product of UNEP and IUCN, and it's managed at UNEP WCMC, where I work. The database can be viewed and downloaded at the Protected Planet website, which is shown on the screen. It's the most comprehensive global database of protected areas, and it provides the official indicators on progress towards targets relating to protected areas. It's also used to inform decision-making across multiple sectors, and for both of those uses, it's obviously vital that the database is complete. But unfortunately, we know that this isn't the case. So although the WDPA is very up to date for protected areas under the governance of governments, it significantly underrepresents protected areas under other governance types. So for the purposes of this webinar, I'm going to focus on the lack of data on privately protected areas, meaning those under the governance of individual landowners, non-profit organizations, and for-profit organizations. Privately protected areas make up only 8% of the records in the WDPA, and the vast majority of those are confined to just a handful of countries. So the areas you can see in blue on the map are the privately protected areas currently recorded in the database. I imagine there's members of the audience right now who are thinking, my country has privately protected areas, why aren't they showing up on the map? And that's completely valid because we know that this map doesn't represent accurately the situation on the ground. So I'm going to talk a bit about the reasons behind this and what we as a community with a stake in privately protected areas can do to improve the situation. So the first reason for the lack of data is that some governments simply don't recognize privately protected areas as part of their national networks, or that they just don't have centralized data on them. And since national governments are the WDPA's primary data providers, this often means that data on privately protected areas just doesn't get submitted to the database. In other cases, it might be the decision of the private landholder not to share their data, and privacy concerns are a common reason for this. Another reason that privately protected areas might not show up on the map is that they are missing information that allows us to identify them as privately governed. So I've highlighted a couple of examples on this map in purple. So these are Brazil's RPPNs and New Zealand's Queen Elizabeth II National Trust Network. So both of these networks are in the WDPA, but either don't have a recorded governance type, or they have a governance type that suggests that they're not privately governed. So without this additional information, users of the database wouldn't be able to identify these networks as networks of privately protected areas. And this emphasizes the need for complete tabular data as well as complete spatial data in the WDPA. So why is this important? Firstly, because we can't accurately track progress towards global targets if we don't have all the pieces of the puzzle. So the recently published Protected Planet report showed that the world has reached its 2020 target to protect or conserve 17% of the world's land. And it also showed that marine coverage has tripled since 2010. But without comprehensive data on all types of protected areas, we know that this isn't the whole picture. And it goes beyond percentage coverage. So without complete data, we don't know how well connected the world's network of protected and conserved areas is. We don't know the extent to which it covers areas of importance for biodiversity, or whether it covers a representative sample of the world's ecosystems. Fundamentally, the problem is that if we don't have a full picture of what is already conserved, it makes it very difficult to decide what to do next. So how do we target conservation interventions to the places that need them most if we don't know what's already being done? How do we set meaningful global targets if we don't know what we've already achieved? And looked at another way, the missing data on privately protected areas can be seen as just one symptom of a lack of recognition for the work and commitment of private individuals and organizations whose contributions to conservation deserve to be celebrated. So how do we rectify this? The first point to make is that privately protected areas should be recorded in the WDPA as protected areas. So there's been some confusion about whether privately protected areas should actually be recorded as OECMs. It's important to emphasize that this isn't the case. So privately governed areas that meet the IUCN definition of a protected area can be recorded in the WDPA as protected areas, and this is the case regardless of whether they've been legally designated. Data can be provided by the national government, by private landholders, or by third parties acting on their behalf. In all of these cases, data should only be provided once the landholders have given their consent. Data from non-government sources goes through an additional verification process. So a verification process supported by experts is currently under development. But at the moment, the most straightforward option is for the relevant national government to verify the data. UNEP WCMC can facilitate this. And a good example is New Zealand's network of privately protected areas. So in 2020, the Queen Elizabeth II National Trust provided data on nearly 5,000 privately protected areas on behalf of a network of private landholders. And this data was subsequently verified by the national government before being added to the WDPA. So in terms of the specific data requirements, there are more details in the WDPA manual, which is available in multiple languages via the links on the screen. But briefly, there are 4 things that we require. So the first is spatial data in a GIS format. We strongly encourage polygons representing the boundaries of protected areas, but point locations are also accepted. The second is tabular data in the format of the WDPA schema. This includes basic information like the name and the status and the governance type of the protected area. And again, full details are available in the manual. We also require information on the source of the data. And finally, we require a signed data contributor agreement for which a template is available in the manual. So once these 4 pieces of information have been compiled, they should be sent to the email address shown on the screen. You can also contact us at this email address if you have any questions. And if you do have privacy concerns, as I mentioned earlier, it's important to be aware that you can ask us not to share your data. So this means that we'll store your data internally and use it for things like calculating the area covered by protected areas, for example, but it won't be viewable or downloadable from the Protected Planet website. And we also won't share it with anyone else. There are obviously downsides to this as well, since your data won't be available to inform decision-making, won't be available to inform analysis or planning carried out by other users of the WDPA, but it's good to know that the option is there. So finally, I'd like to touch on how this process differs from the process for recording data on OECMs. As I mentioned earlier, there's sometimes some confusion about the relationship between privately protected areas and OECMs. There are a number of differences between protected areas and OECMs. But if you're a private landholder and you're unsure which category your land falls into, the most important distinction to keep in mind is this. If one of your primary management objectives is biodiversity conservation, there's a good chance that you have a privately protected area. If biodiversity conservation is not your primary objective, but the activities that you're carrying out are resulting in conservation, then there's a good chance that you have an OECM. There is obviously more to it than that. And you should consult the guidance on OECMs or the guidelines on privately protected areas before reaching a final conclusion. But I think making this distinction is a really helpful first step. I've also included a link at the bottom of this slide, which you'll have access to when you receive the slides, to a WCPA technical note that goes into more detail on this subject. If you are a private landowner and you conclude that you are managing an OECM, then the process is the same as the one that I described earlier for privately protected areas. So the data requirements are the same, apart from just a couple of differences in the tabular data that we require. You can, again, report directly or via the national government or via a third party. And if you don't report via the national government, again, a verification process is required. So that's all the same as the process for privately protected areas. The only real difference is that your data will be included in the World Database on OECMs rather than the WDPA. So to conclude, there is obviously a lot of work that needs to be done to ensure that privately protected areas are accounted for when we talk about the state of protected areas globally. But examples like New Zealand recording 5,000 privately protected areas in 2020 show how much progress we can make when governments and private organizations work together. So thank you for joining the webinar. Feel free to ask me any questions or send any questions to the email address shown on the screen after the event. Thanks.